Hello and welcome to another episode of Katie the Science Lady. I'm Mrs. Jacobson, and today's topic is the cell membrane structure. So let's learn together. Alright guys, let's talk about the cell membrane. Today we're going to be going over structure and function with a little more emphasis on the structure part because it's pretty complicated, our cell membranes. Your cell membrane has a couple of functions. Its first and primary job is to regulate what enters and exits your cell. You don't want things entering your cell that could potentially harm it or could be toxic to your cells, and you want to make sure that all your waste products get out of your cells. Because if waste products build up in the cell, then it can be really dangerous. It also allows for cell-to-cell recognition. We talked about this back when we discussed glycoproteins on the outside of viruses. Now, viruses are not cells, and they don't have cell membranes, but cell membranes have glycoproteins just like the outsides of viruses do. And the glycoproteins job we'll go over in a future slide here. So in just a moment, we'll talk about glycoproteins. It also gives a cell its shape and support. That is one of the biggest functions. Without a cell membrane, your cell doesn't really have a boundary. There's nowhere for the cytoplasm to hold your cell together. You need that external barrier to keep your cell intact. And that's probably one of the most important functions of the cell membrane. It is called the phospholipid bilayer. So your cell membrane is made up of two layers of these things called phospholipids. And we've heard of lipids before when we talked about biomolecules. Lipids are fats. And we see that here where it's got the head of the lipid and then the tail of the lipid. But they've snuck in this little phosphate, or this phosphorus molecule in there. So that's what it means by phospholipid. Now our actual cell membrane is going to be consisting of two layers of these, and they have a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail. This, what's called polar head on here, is also hydrophilic, meaning it has an affinity or a tendency to go towards water. Or if you wanted to define it, it would be hydro means water, philic is love. So it loves water. So the hydrophilic parts are going to be on the outside of the cell membrane because it wants to be closer to the water environment that your cell is going to live in. On the flip side, it has a nonpolar tail, which we call hydrophobic. Hydro again meaning water, but phobic like phobia meaning fear. So that nonpolar tail is water fearing, and it doesn't want to have anything to do with water itself. So it's going to make up the inside of the cell membrane, so it doesn't have to touch the water on the outside. So here's where we see that. We see those little kind of reddish pink shapes on the top here, and on the bottom, those are the hydrophilic heads. And in the middle, we have the hydrophobic tails. They're all together. So that's where we have 1 and 2 layers here, or a bilayer. You can kind of see a little bit better in this image where we have the actual shape of a cell, more of a sphere, and you still see that you've got 1 layer of lipids on the top with the tails on the inside, and 1 layer of lipids on the bottom here with the tails again pointing towards the inside. So that's a really important thing to understand, is that it's not just 1 layer, there's actually 2 layers of these phospholipids working together. The second thing we need to remember about our cell membrane is that it is selectively permeable or semi-permeable. It doesn't just let anything go through. I think of it as the gatekeeper for your cell. Only certain things are allowed to come in and only certain things are allowed to leave your cell. Usually some very small molecules can pass directly between those phospholipids in the bilayer, and those are things like water, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and other things, but mostly really small molecules. Our phospholipid bilayer, if you have a large or charged molecule, meaning something that's positive or negatively charged, it has to pass through something called a transport protein. Now, we talked about this when we will talk about this when we talk about passive transport and active transport. But there are 3 main types of transport proteins to talk about today: the channel protein, the carrier protein, and the protein pump. The channel and carrier proteins are involved in passive transport, meaning they do not use energy, they don't use ATP, and they bring molecules from high to low concentration, or from where there's more of something to where there is less of something. The protein pump is the opposite. It is involved in active transport, and it requires ATP energy, and it moves molecules from where they are in low concentration to where they are in high concentration. So it's kind of like pushing something up a hill almost. You need a lot of energy to do that. So here's an example of all three. The channel protein allows molecules to go straight through from high to low. The carrier does similarly the same thing, goes again from high to low, but lets certain amounts in at a time. And then our protein pump usually is an exchange of some kind. The most famous pump that we are usually aware of is the sodium-potassium pump, where sodium ions are exchanged for potassium ions. And it helps us send signals through our nervous system and helps our muscles to contract as well. Now, the cell membrane is something that we can call the fluid mosaic model. This is getting slightly outdated now, but you may still hear this at times. And what it means is a couple of things. The lipid bilayer is described as a fluid mosaic, and there's two components. The first part is that fluidity. Because we have two layers, or a lipid bilayer, they can move on top of each other freely. So they can move side to side, it can travel. It's really fluid and has a lot of motion to it. It's not rigid. The second part is that it's a mosaic, and a mosaic is a pattern in art, and it's created by scattered proteins in our lipid bilayer. And those proteins go through the cell membrane to allow molecules to go in and out of the cell. Now, I like to think of this as kind of like a chocolate chip cookie, like a mosaic, because you have the chocolate chips that are kind of scattered in there, like the proteins are in a cell membrane. And now I'm hungry, so that's what happens every time I talk about this. We have other components to our cell membrane as well, besides just our lipid bilayer and our proteins. We have glycoproteins. Now, we talked about glycoproteins earlier, and also when we talked about viruses. They help recognize other cells with attached carbohydrate chains. So those specific carbohydrate chains tell the cell what each cell is. And they look like this. There are different ones for toxins, viruses, bacteria, other cells, and it's consistent. It holds onto a protein, and then that carbohydrate chain comes off of the protein that's in the cell membrane. Another component of the cell membrane is cholesterol. It is found only in animal cell membranes, so you won't find this in plant cells or in like fungus cell membranes, and it helps maintain fluidity. You also will not find it in prokaryotic cell membranes. Remember, all cells have cell membranes, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. It's common to all cells, not viruses, because viruses are not cells and they are not alive. Just a reminder. And this cholesterol helps our cell maintain its fluidity. You can see it's these little hexagonal shapes in between our lipid bilayer, and it just gives our lipids more room to move side to side. So it gives us a little extra wiggle room, basically, in our cell membrane. Let's recap some of the key points about the cell membrane. The first is that a cell membrane is semi-permeable, and it is what it sounds like. Only certain things are allowed in and out of a cell. It's not going to accept everything into the cell, and it's not going to let just anything leave. It has to be a gatekeeper for the cell's activities. A good thing to remember is that a cell membrane is part of every type of cell, prokaryotic and eukaryotic alike. The second key point to remember about the cell membrane is that it's made of a phospholipid bilayer. That's essentially two layers of lipids stacked on top of each other that keep the water on either side of itself. Now, this phospholipid bilayer has many things going through it. It has proteins that span the entire surface of that phospholipid bilayer and go from one side of the cell membrane to the other. It also has different carbohydrate chains and other various things like glycoproteins that allow cells to attach to other cells via their cell membrane. It's a pretty complicated structure, and it's a good idea to take some time to look at a diagram of it to familiarize yourself with most of its components. Well, please like, subscribe, and comment. I appreciate everything that y'all do. That's all I have today. So I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you later.